Hello and welcome to a new talk, a new lecture, part of our Heritage series. Here at the Sheikh Abdullah Science Centre, we're delighted to have with us Dr. Melanie Gibson, who's going to talk to us about an elegant garden, the Ottoman ceramics from 1480 to 1600. Ottoman ceramics, sometimes known as İznik, after the town where large quantities of tiles and tableware were produced throughout the 16th century, have long been admired for their glowing colours and elegant floral designs. During the first half of the 16th century, the İznik kilns concentrated on producing vessels, mainly large dishes, in which food was served at the Ottoman court. With the accession of Sultan Süleyman, an ambitious building program was begun, and demand for glazed tiles to decorate mosques and other buildings reached a high point. By 1570s, the fame of the İznik's beautiful tiles and tableware had gone beyond Istanbul, and it was produced in ever larger quantities for sale to a wide market that included commissions from Europe. This lecture will look at how the İznik industry developed and expanded from its first beginnings in the late 15th century to its decline in the 17th century. Dr. Melanie Gibson is the editor of the Gingko Art Series and was formerly head of the art history at the New College of the Humanities in London. Since 2005, she's lectured on the ceramics and glass of the Islamic world for SARS, the Courtauld Institute, the Arkan University, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and also the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, in Qatar. Specialties are the ceramics and glass of the Islamic world, and her most recent publication is a chapter on the ceramics of Iran in Bestowing Beauty, Masterpieces from Persian Lands. There will be a Q&A sessions at the end, so please type your questions to Dr. Gibson in the chat and I will read them out to her. Melanie, if you're ready, you can start.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. Good evening. Welcome to everyone. So as Sammy said, I'm going to be talking about the ceramics of Ottoman ceramics, the ceramics of İznik. I'm sure this is a subject that's quite familiar to some of you, as dishes with the vivid floral designs are to be seen in virtually every museum collection in the world and many, many private ones. It was a period of extraordinary industrial production. So the two tiles you can see here, of course, these are tiles from buildings. But let's go back to the beginning. We'll go back to the conquest of Constantinople, later renamed Istanbul by Mehmet II, known as the Conqueror. And almost immediately, he started building a palace, which is what you see here. This is the Topkapı Saray. On this map, this is an Italian map. You can see it's portrayed as a kind of classic fortified palace. But in fact, as many of you know, it's a series of courtyards which access to them was restricted as you went further and further into the palace. And I wanted to show you a picture of one. This is the second courtyard with the library on the right, looking at it as it would be looked actually if you were there right now in the spring through a flower bed full of tulips. And it's the case that the Ottomans adored flowers, all flowers, and travelers and visitors to the capital and elsewhere in Turkey remarked on this love of flowers. And so I just pulled out one particular quote from this individual, a Frenchman called Philippe Dufresne-Canet, who was there actually after the period of Sultan Süleyman in 1572. And he remarks on how one can hardly believe how much the Turks love flowers, how they always have one in the turban or one in the hand. And so I chose this painting for you of Sultan Mehmet II, delicately holding a rose up to his nose to smell the scent. Now, the other reason for showing you a picture of the Topkapı was I wanted to really talk about how within the palace, the workshops, the craft workshops were situated within the palace. And just to give you a little indication of how they worked. So the workshops were known as the Ahli Hiref, and we have payroll registers, so we have some kind of indication of how they worked and how they were structured. And we know that they were broken down into each company had a master, apprentices and different workers. And we know some of these payroll registers have survived, and so we know the kind of payments that were made to them. But more importantly, we know some of the names of the craftsmen. One of the critical companies was the company of designers, the Nakash, and These were artists who decorated manuscripts, but they also produced designs which were then handed on to textile and ceramics workshops, for instance. So on the screen, what you've got is a textile on the left, and a detail from a ceramic, a large ceramic bowl on the right with the classic saz leaf and rosette design. But you can see how close the design is on both, whether on either medium, which gives you an indication that these were, these artists were working to designs produced from the design workshop. We're very lucky in that, because of these registers, that we have the names of 3 of the main designers in the period of the late 15th and 16th century. I won't be looking except peripherally or just momentarily at the first designer, who's called Baba Nakash, but I will be focusing on the work of 2 very significant and very important and very, very talented designers. The drawing on the left was made by someone called Shah Kulu, and on the right by someone who's, in fact, his pupil, who is called Karamemi. And I'll be talking about them really entirely in regard to the designs that they made for ceramics. So we'll talk about them later in the lecture. So this is sometimes known as İznik ware, although more correctly it should be known as Ottoman ceramics. But of course, the reason for calling it İznik ware is that Iznik, the city of Iznik, which is here on the map, it's at about 2 days' journey from Istanbul by land, although it would have been shorter by sea. An ancient center of ceramics production. It had large resources of clay, of water, and of fuel, and it is where the industrial production of ceramics took place. We also know that ceramics were produced in Istanbul and in Kütahya, but really crucially, İznik was the main center, and this was the plan that was made of the city in 1537 on the right. Now, why İznik? Well, apart from its natural resources, it was perfectly situated in terms of its clay and access also to fuel. There were a lot of forests around. You need a lot of wood when you're constantly firing kilns. But actually, it had a history of ceramic production. And these pieces that you see on the screen, including one in the Al-Sabah collection in Kuwait, are pieces of the type of ceramics that were being produced at İznik, although rather it's a little bit confusing that they're called Miletus ware, but that is related to where they were found and attributed to a city called Miletus. But actually, they are made in İznik, but they're made of earthenware with covered in a white slip, and then painted in cobalt in a very different technique. The actual body is very different from the pieces of ceramic that we're going to be looking at shortly. In fact, right now, because I want to explain to you before we kick off exactly what the type of ceramic was that İznik wares were made out of. So instead of being earthenware, it's a body that is largely made of silica. So you have to imagine that it's made out of pebbles, effectively, silica pebbles that are crushed fine and combined with 1/4 of clay, 75% of quartz and 25% of clay, ground very, very finely. And this gives you a very beautiful white body, which is about as close as potters from the Middle East ever got to producing porcelain. They never actually had the technology for making porcelain, but very often that's what they were imitating, the hardness and whiteness of porcelain. The body was then painted with a slip. So that is a coating of fine white clay to give it extra whiteness. And any pigments, cobalt or any of the pigments that we use were painted onto this white body. And then it was covered in a transparent glaze. And crucially, the ceramics made at İznik had an incredibly glassy glaze, which gives you this wonderful effect. I particularly chose this piece so you could see quite how glassy and transparent this glaze was and how shiny it was. And the effect of the glaze was to really emphasize the colors. It's a bit like when you dunk something in water and it brings up the colors and it makes them much shinier and more vibrant. So that was the result of having this very gorgeous, transparent, glossy glaze. So starting at the beginning of production, which we can date to around 1480, so a couple of decades after the conquest of Istanbul. And what you can see on the screen are 2 dishes. Now, the top one is actually a Chinese dish. It was made at Jingko in China, which was the center of porcelain production from the late 13th century onwards. And you can see from the dish on the top, which is the Chinese dish, it's painted with bands of decoration, and that's exactly what the potters in Istanbul, possibly rather than İznik at the beginning, are copying. So concentric bands of decoration with a very dark blue, and very much inspired by Yuan wares. And at this period, we have the first designer, Baba Nakash, is probably in charge of the designs. I'm just going to show you a couple more. So you can see that the inspiration is very much Chinese, but also in the center, we have this, this kind of interlaced design with these half palmette motifs. And this, in fact, is taken from metalware, from silverware, rather than from any other source. So we have a combination of Turkish silverware and Chinese ceramics as inspiration. And actually, the floral element is really rather subdued. We do have these peonies or flowers, little fat little flowers appearing all around the rim, but they're really not what the dish is focused on. That's not what the decoration is focused on at all. Now, the son of Mehmet, Bayezid, he builds a large complex with a mosque, a madrasa, very many other buildings in Istanbul. And these two mosque lamps, together with a few others, were made for that complex. So we can date them to around 1512. So this is the progression. And we can see that the craftsmen now are more interested in having a slightly, leaving more white space, so that the blue, there's more contrast between the blue and the white. And actually the designs, the motifs, the floral motifs are more visible now. Still very much a blue and white palette, and still very much with a sort of Chinese inspiration. And here I've selected these three pieces because the sort of significant book on İznik was written by Julian Raby and Nurhan Aksoy some decades back. But they identified one of the craftsmen from this period, who they call the master of the knots, because of his love of creating these knots, like here that you can see on the inside of this dish, or here in the interlace of the uprights of the script on this pen box in the British Museum, or here on this lamp, which is in the Çinili kiosk in Istanbul. Still very much blue and white, however. And the break, the significant watershed and moment which really sees the transformation of the ceramic style is the date 1514, when Selim I marches on Tabriz, which he travels from Istanbul to Tabriz. And in the outskirts of Tabriz, there is a significant battle, the Battle of Chaldiran, where the Safavids are defeated. And as a result of this defeat, Selim is able to bring back craftsmen and indeed also objects back to Istanbul. And it is the introduction of these craftsmen from Tabriz who then create a significant difference in the way, the sort of style of Ottoman art. And this is actually combined with the accession of Suleiman just a few years later, Sultan Suleiman, whose reputation is for a real love of flowers and love of gardens. He was trained as a goldsmith, and he was passionate about art and architecture. He has important relationships with his chief architect, Sinan, and is a patron of note. And really his input is visible in the type of art that begins to be produced from around 1520. So I show him here, we have this image of him from the historical manuscript, the Suleiman Name, and the artist has tried to represent different courtyards within the Topkapı. So here is Suleiman sitting on his throne. He's the largest figure, as you would expect, and he's having an audience with, or rather Barbarossa, his Admiral Barbarossa is having an audience with him, significantly smaller, and sitting at a lower than him. But what I really want you to focus on is the fact that this is gorgeous garden painted against this gold ground. So of course this is inspired entirely from Persian painting, but it's the fact that we've got cypress trees and prunus blossoms and more cypress trees behind that we're seeing here. So to give you a sense of the kind of floral magnificence and floral profusion that you would have found by going into the Topkapı and any other elite houses or palaces of this time. And here's the same Philippe de Fresne-Canet, the Frenchman who I quoted earlier, who again talks about how in all of these gardens, there is such a quantity of all sorts of flowers that just by stretching out one's hand, one can gather a bouquet with every color imaginable. So this love of flowers is very significant of this period. And suddenly we're going to see it in every type of art. In textiles, so we see this beautiful series of leaves with hyacinths down the center. This is the tura, the official signature of the Sultan. And this is the tura of Sultan of Suleiman the Magnificent, with this wonderful bouquet of carnations in the center. We're obviously going to see tiles and tableware. That's what we're going to talk about for the rest of my time with you. But equally, even in battle, an Ottoman soldier, Janissary, would go into battle with a shield such as this one, with these fantastic carnations all over the surface. Now, it was clearly the input of Şarkulu, this is the Turkish spelling of his name, who's an artist and designer who we know was leading the design studio from 1526, and he was there for nearly 3 decades. He first appears on the payroll register of 1526 as Şarkulu Baghdadi. And we think he trained as an artist in Tabriz, and he joined the Nakashkhana around 1520, so sometime after the Battle of Chaldiran, so he may not have come direct as booty from Tabriz, or he may have done. And he was a contemporary historian called Mustafa Ali tells us that Suleiman used to go to watch Şarkulu at work in his studio, and he frequently rewarded him with gifts. And I would suggest, although we of course don't have any evidence for this, that there was a relationship of patron and artist between the two of them, and that, you know, that he would have produced work and would have consulted perhaps even with the Sultan. So these are 2 of his drawings, and I want you to notice one thing in particular, which is this design feature that he has of these very thick black lines. You see it here on the spine of the dragon, but you see it also on the curve of the leaves. And the first piece of ceramic that I'm going to show you is these 2 panels in the Topkapi Saray. They form part of a kiosk which was reconstructed in 1641, but was originally built in 1527. So if you remember, that's about a year after Şarkulu becomes the head of the design studio. And the outer walls at present, we don't know how they were originally structured, but this is how they were rebuilt in 1641. They were these 2 panels here, and we've got some similar panels on the other side as well. But we don't know what exactly the design was when they were first installed. But the reason I want to show them to you is because the drawing and the draftsmanship is absolutely exquisite. And it's been suggested that they were painted by Şarkulu himself, and I have no reason to disbelieve that suggestion. I think it makes a lot of sense. They're very hard to photograph because they're behind perspex panels. But what you see are 2 panels. They're 125 centimeters in height, which is huge for ceramics. It's really astonishing to be able to produce panels which remain flat and don't warp, and are of that size without cracking or breaking in the kiln. The designs are in mirror image, so it's exactly the same design with these 2 qilin, which are imaginary Chinese deer. They're kind of unicorn imaginary creatures, down here nestling in amongst this wonderful profusion of saz leaves and these great big blooms. And we also have a pair of birds in each one. So there's a bird here and another one here. And then within spandrels with these wonderful cloud bands between them. So I'm going to take you in even further. So this is the left-hand panel. So you can see this is very, very much blown up. But I want you to see why it's possible that Şarkulu was the artist of these panels. So the draftsmanship, as you can see, is absolutely exquisite, with many different shades of cobalt, a little bit of turquoise. But we also can see this dark line, his signature dark line along the spine of the animal, the qilin, and elsewhere on the flowers. And it's a feature of when you decorate ceramics, that when you apply the color onto the unglazed surface, in other words, onto the white slip background, you have one shot at it. That's all. You cannot make mistakes. There is no corrections that can be made. So you have to have an incredibly sure and practiced hand when you paint something as sophisticated as this. And these panels are unique. There are no others. just to show you a few more details. And here you can also see in the transparent bit here, you can see how glassy the glaze is on top. So here's the bird that was perched at the top of the panel. So just to, so we'll move from tiles to tableware. So the conquest of Tabriz brought a lot of craftsmen, but it also brought a lot of Chinese porcelain. We know that the palace collection, which by the way is one of the biggest in the world, its only rival is in the Ardabil shrine in Iran, it was put together over many decades. And right at the beginning of the Ottoman regime in Istanbul, it's actually very small. So we have an inventory of 1495 that only mentions a few pieces. After the Battle of Chaldiran and the sack of Tabriz, we have a whole lot more arriving. And yet more pieces were seized from Mamluk palaces in Cairo and Damascus in 1517. And this influx of Chinese porcelain, largely in blue and white, clearly had an impact on the designers in the studio. And they were able to study these pieces and to create designs, which they then passed on to the ceramics workshops. So in the period between around 1520 to 1540, we start to get these type of pieces. The one on the right is in the Chinli kiosk. And they're very, very closely modeled on Chinese prototypes. So we get the same kind of designs, floral designs, the rock and wave pattern on around the rim, the foliation. So you can see that these dishes are lobed. Around the same time as this is happening, we've got artists trying to explore other types of designs. So perhaps designed by Shakulu, perhaps not. He would have been responsible for the design within the Tura of the Sultan. This is another one, another Tura of Suleiman. And you can see that this is made up of tight spirals, which is exactly what we see being reproduced on the ceramic, on this bottle and on this little tankard. Actually, although it was incredibly time consuming and laborious to produce, it's not a particularly effective type of design for ceramic. It all looks a bit too busy and a bit bitty. We get a significant, all of the pieces that I've shown you up until now have not been dated or have not had signatures. So the mosque lamp that you see here on the right is rather important because it actually is signed and dated. It was made for the refurbishment that was initiated by Suleiman of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which by that stage, the mosaic which were placed on the exterior had really all started to fall off. And so he decided that he would send along a craftsman called Abdullah Tabrizi, who restored the entire exterior. The present exterior, as you see it now, is not the one from the Suleiman period. It was restored again in the 20th century. So this lamp here that is in the British Museum gives the name of its maker, Musli, and the date 1549. So it's rather an important benchmark in terms of the type of decoration and how we date it of this period. But the most significant decoration, and the one that I'm going to focus on the next few slides, and the one that is most closely related to the two tile panels that I showed you with the chiline and the birds, is this, which is described as saz leaf and rosette. So the saz leaf was this particular serrated leaf that was a speciality of Shakulu. And in the 1550s, we get a new development in tableware in the addition of these two new colors. So we've seen turquoise and cobalt on a white ground before, but now we get the addition of green, this rather bright, sort of slightly limey green here. More characteristic is this sagey, slightly softer sagey green, and it's combined with this very gorgeous lilac-y purple. And here, although we've got the saz leaf and rosette dominating on this large bowl, we've also started to see the introduction of the tulip. So along the band at the bottom here, we've got little bunches of tulips, and here very visibly here on this dish, we've got these two tulips with them, three pointy petals in the center, and more bouquets around the edge. Karamemi, who I mentioned earlier, was the pupil of Shakulu, and his name is, his full name was actually Mehmed al-Siyah, but this is an abbreviation. Memi is an abbreviation of Mehmet, and Kara means black, which is also what Siyah means. So that's how he obviously had the nickname Karamemi. So as I said, he's a pupil of Shakulu. We don't know any more about him than that, except that in 1545, he receives 16.5 akçe, that's his yearly salary. And then suddenly in 1557 to 8, he receives a huge bonus for illuminating a Quran. Now, I haven't illustrated the Quran, although we do have it. And in that same year, he also became head of the atelier. What you see on the screen is a collection of poems of Suleiman. And what you can see is that the illumination in the margins has got these absolutely exquisite design. On this side, we've got rosebuds springing out of this leaf, and they're very beautifully colored as well. And on the other side, we've got a more sort of stylized floral designs. But every single margin of the pages of this book have got different floral designs. And we know that it was Karamemi who made them, and that these are the collected poems of Suleiman. So the kind of relationship that Suleiman had with Shakulu seems to be continued here with his pupil. Now, Karamemi changes the style quite significantly. So whereas before we were looking at very rotational floral design, so they cover the whole surface going around, you don't have any kind of an axis. Here what we've got is an axial design. Some flowers are recognizable, such as the hyacinth and the tulip, but we've still got some fairly inventive, imaginative designs. But significantly, the flower, it's like a bouquet of flowers that is growing from the ground. And we've even got little roots that seem to be shown. And here you can even see on this piece, which is from the Louvre, we've got little tiny filaments showing you the roots even more closely. So this is a kind of radical shift in terms of aesthetic. It's something completely different. And Michael Rogers, quite a while ago, suggested that this was very much tied up with the influx, the kind of introduction of books of botanical drawings known as herbals, which arrived in Istanbul at about this time. So we know this particular book was illustrated by Pierandrea Mattioli, and he was a botanist, an Italian botanist, who we know was in touch with a certain Willem Quackelbeen, and he was the doctor of an ambassador in Istanbul. So there's every reason to suppose that books of botanical drawings such as these, with realistic depictions of flowers with the roots at the bottom. So here we've got a tulip, rather charmingly, and we've got the root of the bulb at the bottom and the flower shown in cross section as well as in plan. So it looks as if these type of herbal, these type of books were the inspiration, that they were making their way either as gifts or one way or another they arrived in Istanbul, and that Karamemi was able to see such books, and he then introduced this kind of drawing to his designs for the ceramics. So we end up with a beautiful plate like this, where you can sort of see this actually doesn't have roots at the bottom like the two previous pieces that I showed you. But here we've got a little clump of leaves, and then all of the stems of the flowers are springing from the root. And so here we've got daisies and tulips effectively. And I can see the relationship between this, the way it's drawn, the tulips cut through, and this herbal book of drawings here. So just to show you another couple of examples, the root is quite often misunderstood. It looks more like a little bit of ribbon as it does here, but in some of the dishes you can see actual little roots, like the piece in the Louvre. We start to get a more formalized design composition here. So in very many cases we have the Chinese rock and wave around the rim, and then the whole of the center of the design of the dish. These are all large shallow dishes used for eating. They were used in the kitchens, they were stored in the kitchens, and this is how the food was served every day to all the people who were working in the Topkapi. Now, I said earlier that Suleiman was a great patron of architecture, and the architect he worked with was Sinan, who started working as his architect in the middle of the century. And one of the earliest mosques that he designed was this little mosque, which is the Hadim Ibrahim Pasha Jami. Hadim Ibrahim Pasha was a vizier. He was a eunuch at court, and he, you can see that the lunettes, so these are the doorways of this is the front of the mosque, the entrance to the mosque. Here's the main doorway here. We've got these rather exquisite little panels, and here it is blown up above. The calligraphy stands out beautifully against the blue background. And in the background, we've got some really elegant little flowers painted, a tulip here and a carnation here. However, when you look from far away, as you come into the courtyard of the mosque, you can see the blue and white, but it's the colors meld into each other. They don't have very graphic contrast. And it's clear that it was probably Sinan who liked using tiles in the buildings he designed, that he introduced a new idea and a new color scheme. We don't know who exactly it was who introduced this idea, but it seems that it possibly came from architecture rather than from tableware. So this is the complex, the Suleymaniye, that was commissioned by Suleiman from around 1550 from Sinan. And just like the earlier mosque that I showed you, over the doorway, so this is the main doorway, but we've got 4 panels over the doorways, and these are blow-ups of the doorways. And you can see that, again, we've got white calligraphy, which stands out very well against the dark blue background, but in the corner pieces, we've got little corners of red. And I would say, if you sort of half close your eyes, the red actually jumps out. There's something about the contrast of the red against the blue and the white that is a much more graphic and effectively graphic contrast than the purple was before. So the craftsmen are clearly given this mission that they have to produce red, and how to produce red. Red on ceramics is a very difficult color to achieve. Iron is the mineral that is required, and Armenian bole is an iron-rich clay that's plentifully available near deposits of it are found near Kütahya. But the craftsmen have to experiment, and this lamp, which was made for the Suleymaniye, is one of these experiments. It's in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London now, but you can see that the colors are rather thin. It's not very, it's all a bit thinner and a bit orangey. And it's not until many experiments later that the craftsmen achieve the kind of characteristic bright red that is the fantastic contrast to the white and the blue, and that is the characteristic kind of Izniq palette that we're accustomed to. And it was only by building up the red, by adding it to slip, in other words, to clay, watered down clay, and by adding the pigment to that they can achieve. So when you run your hand over the surface of a piece which has red in it, you will always feel the red. It will stand proud of the surface in a way that the rest of the colors don't. The rest of the colors are flush with the surface. The red will always stand out, because that was the only way of successfully achieving this nice rich red. So this is the tomb of the wife of Suleiman. And it has got a sort of floral design, but not really the sort of naturalistic floral design, that it's much more geometric. And you can see the palmettes here and these kind of imaginative sort of cabbage-like flowers. And also the red is still relatively discreet. Where we get an absolute explosion of floral designs is in the Rustem Pasha Mosque. Rustem Pasha was a vizier who was married to Suleiman and Hurrem's daughter, Mihrima, and he designs the mosque himself, although he actually dies before it's completed, and it's thought that Mihrima completed the commission. It was built between 1561 and 1563. For the last few years, it's been closed for restoration. I very much hope, I haven't been to Istanbul for a couple of years. I'm hoping that the next time I go, it will be open again. And it's a complete pattern book of designs on the inside and on the outside. It's the most overwhelmingly beautiful jewel of a mosque. So starting from the exterior, it's actually on the first floor of the bazaar, the Weaver's Bazaar. And you go upstairs and you come up along here, and then you come around the corner and you see this facade, which has got an extraordinary series of panels, of which this is the most stupendous, with this exquisite series of flowering. It's a flowering cherry blossom with tulips and narcissa and hyacinths all around. It's a very special panel, this. But as you can see, it's made with squares. And that was the point, that when you've got all these ceramics being made in İznik, which is a journey away from Istanbul, the tiles cannot be made as single tiles. It's much easier, and you're going to be able to have more freedom if you have square tiles which can be sort of fitted together, and you can therefore slightly allow the mortar, the size of the mortar to fit it together, so that you can have a little bit of difference in the sizes. This is the narcissi, a blow up of the narcissi that you can see here. You can almost see that the red is in relief from the way the light is catching it. Exquisitely painted. And here are just a selection of some of the floral designs from the interior. It's a bit overwhelming. You have to get your nose up to the tiles to see what all the different patterns are. So this is in the mihrab, where we've got the vase of flowers with this kind of explosion of cherry blossom or fruit blossom coming in this lobed cartouche. And we've got beautiful combinations of tulips, carnations, not so many roses yet. That's going to be the next stage that we see. So I just wanted to show this particular dish because the implication is that Karamemi was the designer of all the different tile designs within the mosque. And this dish, which is a one-off in the Metropolitan Museum, has the same kind of pattern. This is from the exterior tile panel outside the Rustam Pasha, and you can see the kind of this tulip with these three pointed petals. It has a sort of similar kind of zigzag design. Here, this would be described as the Chintamani design. I can't show you all of the tile panels I'd like to. As you know, very many of them are collected in museums rather than still in situ in their original monuments. They would have been in religious buildings, so mosques, madrasas, tombs. That's why in Istanbul you can see them in tombs and mosques. You can also see them, would have seen them in palaces. You certainly see them in the Topkapı Palace, but there would have been other buildings, other secular buildings where you would have found them. Very many of them at some stage or another were removed from the walls and have found their way into Western collections, and indeed actually collections all over the Middle East as well. So just to give you an idea of these type of the different types of designs, here's a selection. And to remind you that yes, they also were on the interiors of rooms. So these series of spandrels, so these would have been on the inside of a building, you know, of a room, a divan, and would have had shelves on the inside. So they have these very pretty little shaped spandrels. So let's just turn for my last few slides to a number of dishes. So these are, with a small number of motifs, the craftsmen succeed in creating an infinite variety of patterns. So the elements that we see are the rose, it's always in full bloom with its petals thrown back. It's always recognizable because next to it you'll find a rosebud, and also by these sort of slightly serrated, typically you know, rose-like leaves. We find tulips, we find hyacinths, carnations, and cypress trees. There's no, I mean, you can see red, the carnations are very often red, and here the roses are red too, but sometimes the tulips can be blue, but none of this is necessarily consistent. And they mix and match these designs in a number of different ways, so that here we can have a more rotational design. This is more geometric. Sometimes it's more naturalistic. The flowers always appear to me to be almost windswept. The stems curve and sweep. They have incredible amount of movement in them. Here in this dish, the stems have actually almost been snapped off so that the flower can return and come back. All of these different, you can see each one of these I chose, which has a different kind of rim to it. So we've got little bunches of tulips or other flowers, Chintamani designs, back to the Chinese rock and wave design. This is a classic kind of tankard. Before I showed you another couple of shapes. So we largely see dishes, open dishes, which are it's like a canvas in terms of decoration. This is a very rare piece because it's a bowl with a lid. We see very many tankards like this particular shape, which might have been originally inspired by a wooden tankard, vases, and bottles. The craftsmen over this 40-year period, it's essentially, we're talking from around 1560 to 1600, they really show infinite variety. So not confined to the pieces I just showed you, they start to play around with different colored slips, using the slip in the background. This is a bit more unusual, this kind of terracotta browny red, but they're just always playing with leaves and flowers. Here's the prunus blossom that we've seen. So they just use these motifs and then they combine them and change them and in this, and I have never seen two dishes that are the same. It's extraordinary to me the amount of variety that they manage to put into these into their designs. And there are literally hundreds of objects that have survived from this period of production. So the high point ends around the year 1600. Before that, around kind of the last decade between 1590 and 1600, we get a remarkable development, which is for the very first time, the introduction of figurative motifs. So this is a piece in the Metropolitan Museum where we have this rather elegant kneeling musician playing with her tambourine. This is a piece in the museum in Doha, which has got this chained panther or leopard, always within a kind of extraordinary garden with the roses, as both here. And here we've got two little birds tucked away in amongst the roses and the other flowers. But by the year 1600, things are beginning to change. And the decline of, so Iznik is still made in the 17th century, but as the three dishes on the screen show you, things change quite dramatically. So they no longer seem to have the knowledge or the technology to produce that same incredibly vibrant red that we see here. It goes a very brownish pink color. And actually the draftsmanship and the kind of precision and even the whiteness of the background. Just look at the difference between the glowing white here and the much sort of slightly murkier white of these pieces, which all of these three, the tiles as well as the two dishes, were made in the 17th century. It seems that there were a number of different aspects, that contributed to this decline. There was the building of what we know as the Blue Mosque, the Sultan Ahmet Mosque, which there were a lot of quite fierce directives coming from the Divan in Topkapi demanding that the artists should concentrate entirely on making those tiles, that they should ignore any kind of commercial production, we also have a writer called Evliya Çelebi who talks about the decline in the number of workshops in Iznik. So it's not surprising that we end up with pieces that were not as significant. I mean, a period of 120 years of very sustained, consistent excellence is a pretty long period within ceramic terms. So I don't want to leave you with the slightly less beautiful ones. I'll leave you with these two. So these are two of my favorite pieces, and thank you very much for listening. I'm very happy to take questions. I think Sammy is now going to anybody who's got any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a great lecture. You basically given us the history of Iznik in a nutshell, so it was great. Thank you. I think I do have a question from one of my colleagues, Ismail. So you mentioned the mosque lamp that was made for Abdullah Tabrizi for the Dome of the Rock, Jerusalem. So he was asking about the regional style. So after the development in Istanbul and in Iznik, there are some, so parallel developments also in the Arab-speaking world, and he was wondering if you could.
It's not exactly clear how it worked, but certainly the team of craftsmen who went to Jerusalem then seemed to have removed themselves to Damascus, significantly to Damascus. Now we know that also Suleiman was commissioning buildings, quite a significant number of buildings in Damascus and elsewhere in Syria, and a team of craftsmen from Istanbul or from Iznik went there and they bring with them the style that was current in İznik at the time. In other words, the style that doesn't include red. So the technology for using red never gets used in Syria, and so the palette is always of the greens, the purples, the blues, and the turquoises, but the content is very much the same, so that we have very many of the same designs, the same kind of floor designs, not so much the sans leaf and rosette design. Actually, it's precisely the moment of the more naturalistic flowers, the bouquets of flowers, flowers in vases. And if you come, I mean, there, some of these, of course, are still to be seen in mosques in Damascus, although they're quite hard to see. There's the I'm trying to think of the name of the building, but I think Diana Dart will tell us. So she's here. She might be able to tell us the name. But there's also a lot of them were then dispersed at some stage and have reached a museum collection. So we've got a huge number in the Victoria and Albert Museum, for instance, in London, were collected in the late 19th century.
So, and there were tiles and vessels, basically.
So largely tiles. I've no doubt that vessels were made, and we do have a few, but that they're just not on the same scale in terms of numbers as what were being produced in İznik. Right. So yes, there are some, but not and also not of the same quality either. It's largely tiles seems to be is where the focus was.
Because you do hear about obviously Damascus tiles, but you don't hear a lot about Damascus vessels as such.
Exactly. There are a few. There are actually a few in the museum in Damascus. There's a very curious terminology became attached to the study of İznik ceramics. It was people in the 19th century were enthralled by İznik ceramics. So various people who were collecting for the Victoria and Albert Museum and elsewhere. And they were actually copied a lot in the 19th century. And the study gave certain names. So we have, for instance, the Damascus style. I don't refer to the different phases of production or the different phases of the aesthetics in that way, but they got attached to them. So in older books, for instance, Arthur Lane, who was writing in the 40s, his book in the 40s, he talks about the Damascus style. He talks about the Rhodian style for the red, because a lot of these dishes were discovered in Rhodes in the late 19th century.
There is also a question by Diana Dark. So would you say that there is any any relationship between Ottoman tiles and carpets produced over the same period, possibly in the same sort of geography as well?
Yes, the answer is yes. We can't pin down, we don't have any documentary evidence for the relationship, but visually it seems impossible that there wasn't a very close relationship. So, and historically, the theory has been that the artist traveled from Turkey to Syria, bringing the techniques and also the iconography and the aesthetics with them, and then presumably it developed from there.
So you talked to us about the sort of death of İznik, at the beginning of the 17th century. And you know that I'm very much into this revival of the İznik, obviously centuries later. But so what exactly happened? I mean, yes, you showed us this very interesting. I didn't know these images of some of the plates of very bad production. So what happened after that period? Do we witness anything like similar to it, or the ceramics take a different turn? Exactly.
Well, we have several things. We actually have a workshop that is work in Istanbul. So we have 17th century production in Istanbul. We probably have the sort of, it futters on in İznik, but the more important central production becomes Kütahya, which has been a production center since the late 15th century. So we have sort of and it's very much imitating the same styles. So for instance, the style with like the Tura, with the spirals, we have a piece in the British Museum, which has actually got an Armenian inscription underneath. It was made for the Armenian church in that style. So we know that we've got parallel production in both, and Kütahya seems to take over. and is very active all the way into the 19th century.
Yeah.
So, but it's not, it doesn't look like, Kütahya ware doesn't look like the types of pieces that I've been showing you. It has, it's on a white ground, and it's much more figurative. It has a much more naive style. So the sort of the floral style is not really what gets picked up in Kütahya. It's much more the kind of actual figural style that we see.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's the addition of yellow, which we don't get at all within within the IZNIQ.
And a lot of pieces with animals as well, like a large.
The animals and human figures, and they have a very naive. And we have tiles of Kütahya as well. For instance, there's in St. James's Cathedral in Jerusalem. So I think it can be said that these tiles traveled, you know, they weren't, who's to say, you know, I don't know enough about actually Kütahya production to know whether craftsmen from Kütahya again traveled to Jerusalem, opened up a workshop there. That was definitely the case in the 20th century, when again we have another restoration of the Dome of the Rock. An artist is supposed to have come from Aleppo and traveled to Jerusalem, and we've got a whole sort of, their craftsmen are mobile. They go where the patronage is, where the work is. So, you know, there's constant shifting and exchange, and that makes the art historian's job quite difficult in trying to pin things down into boxes.
So for me, the question I always ask myself when I see this decline and everything, because obviously you clearly sort of associate the decline, you know, with obviously the patronage and the fact that, you know, the Sultan of the day asked them to concentrate on different sort of trades, you know, especially for the courts rather than commercial pieces. But then I was wondering about the ingredients, so the formula, so to speak. So do you think it got lost for a very long time, or that people were just not very much interested in this red, for example?
I think they just lost the technique. I think it's in terms of red within the whole span of ceramics in the Middle East. We get red only, other than this moment, in Samanid ceramics, you know, so being made in Nishapur and Bukhara and Samarkand, and we get a red there on slipwares, but it's not, it's really quite difficult. It's difficult to achieve. And so I think the technology for it, and maybe even access to the materials, I think once a formula, you know, a formula gets passed from father to son, and then, you know, an event can happen and that chain can be broken, and then you can't recreate it in the same way because you just don't have the skills any longer.
Exactly. There is no further question. I just wanted to thank you again for this wonderful lecture. I mean, we all enjoyed it, and people can watch it on our channel in the future on YouTube. And so I hope to see you next at the next lecture for us. I think there is another question, sorry, very last one from Diana. Yes, do you think there is any meaning or symbolism to the flowers in the pieces?
So I've read, I think this is something that people are beginning, and particularly Turkish scholars are beginning to explore. Of course, the tulip is critical in this because the word for it is lale, and lale is an anagram of Allah. So there's always been an association between the tulip. And I think it's quite possible that, you know, what we do is we see the cypress, the blossom tree, you know, they're very specific flowers. I mean, there are some less specific ones, like for instance, the daisies or these more imaginary ones. But I'm sure they were the flowers that grew there. I mean, they were the ones that were around, but that were sort of familiar to us. But probably also there was some kind of symbolism attached to them. But it was never written down, and so it's a matter of interpretation. But I think people are doing the interpretation. So yes.
Brilliant. Melanie, thank you again. And we'll hope to see you next, maybe in some of our next lectures, and possibly when we reopen live, you can come visit us and give us a wonderful lecture here at our centre in Kuwait.
My gosh, how long to travel. That would be a great pleasure.
Great. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.